Hello and welcome to this Patch Tuesday for August. It's definitely the second half of this year. We have a lot of vulnerabilities to discuss today. But to start off with, we're going to look at some news. Now, as I mentioned last month, 22H2 will retire on the 14th of October 2025. Now, that's all versions. So there is some confusion around Windows Pro versus Enterprise editions. The very latest version of Windows 10 22H2 that will be supported will expire on 14th of October 2025. On the 1st of October 2023, Microsoft has said that they will officially renaming Azure AD to Entra ID. Now, they've actually already started. So the rebrand, I believe, will be finished in October, but they have already started. Good news is all the capabilities, the APIs, the URLs, everything you've used for sharing and saving your files, PowerShell commandlets, for example, they will all continue to work. And we are at Black Hat. So we are at Black Hat for the next few days. If you'd like to stop by, say hello to us. We're at booth 1360, and we'd love to see you there. Now, Caesar put out a notification that Mozilla Firefox 116 and ESR 115.1, ESR 102.14, and Thunderbird 115.1 and Thunderbird 102.14 have all been updated. There are active exploits taking place. So if you are using Mozilla products, Caesar is recommending and encouraging all customers, all users to apply the necessary updates. Now, let's talk about Patch Tuesday. Now, from the Patch Tuesday perspective, here at Syxsense, we've been delivering managed services for well over a decade, and we deploy about 1 million updates each and every month. So I was actually quite surprised to see that the number of fixes this year, throughout the whole of this year, is increasing and decreasing, but they're actually kind of leveling out. There are 6 critical vulnerabilities, 67 important, and 2 moderate. We do like to pay close attention to certain aspects of the vulnerability itself, and that will help us when choosing how we're going to build our patching strategy for our managed services customers. We have 10 of these particular vulnerabilities are more likely to be weaponized. That doesn't mean they are, but it's more likely that they could be. 2 of them are in fact weaponized, 2 are public aware, and 2 of them have jump points, and they're the most serious ones. That's where you can effectively exploit a piece of code or an application within the operating system, and you can effectively jump from it into another technology. SolarWinds, for example, was a great example of where they came in through one particular exploit, went sideways, and started using other parts of the operating system and networks in order to further expose the exploit. Now, we do have a new bug type in this month. It's quite unique, and we're going to talk more about it. But absolutely the most serious of the vulnerability bug types that have been fixed today is the remote code execution. That's a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute their commands to place malware or other malicious code on your computer or your network. We had 23 of those fixes in this Patch Tuesday. Elevation of privilege vulnerability. That's a threat actor that gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data that they're not supposed to have. We actually had 18 of those, very high as well. If you are choosing bug types as your selection criteria, certainly these 2 should be high on the list. Spoofing vulnerability, that's an act of disguise of a communication or identity. We had 12 fixes. We had 9 fixes for information disclosure. That's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information, such as memory or data held within CPU memory or CPU cycles. It's very serious if those if that breach is passwords. We had 8 denial of service vulnerabilities. That's an attack meant to shut down a machine or a network, making it inaccessible. And we have 3 security feature bypass vulnerabilities. That's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms of a device to gain unauthorized access. Now, the new one we talk about is defense in depth. Now, defense in depth is actually quite something new. I think it was about May this year that Microsoft started talking about defense in depth as they start to build on their threat intelligence services. And basically what the defense in depth bug type is fixes for the different layers of protection within the Microsoft OS. So if you were to take an example of an antivirus, well, you probably will find everyone has an antivirus. And you will also find that you will have spyware and malware and BitLocker firewalls enabled. And each of those are layers, and each of those layers protect a certain aspect of the operating system. Well, Microsoft have released the defense in depth in order to resolve a specific vulnerability that is in fact weaponized to protect customers. So really quite interesting, and I'd like to see more from Microsoft how they develop that further. Now, how are we going to prioritize our patches? Now, as I mentioned, we've been delivering managed services for well over a decade, and this is how we prioritize patches. We use the vendor severity as the original severity source of truth. The vendor severity typically starts at critical, being the very worst, to important, high, medium, and low, and NA. We also have an independent CVSS score. Now that independent CVSS score ranges from 10 to 0, and it's built by an independent authority, taking all aspects of the vulnerability and combining it together into a number. That number from 10 being the very worst and 0 the equivalent of NA severity. Now, when you combine those two together and you have a vendor severity and a CVSS score, you have somewhat, perhaps, a better level of understanding about the seriousness of this vulnerability. And there are scenarios where the vendor severity and the CVSS do not match. So you would prefer to have access to all of the data so that you can make the best and most informed decision about what patches you're deploying in your environment. Next, we've got the type of exploit, the state of the vulnerability. Weaponized means it's actively being used in an exploit. It's actively being used in an attack to spread ransomware or simply to hack into networks to extort cybercrime. Now, when something is weaponized, it obviously is more serious. But weaponization does not go hand in hand with severity. And a lot of weaponized vulnerabilities actually have a lower severity than you would think. Often, the vendor and the CVSS score sometimes change based on weaponization, but not always. So we need to add weaponization into this mix. Public aware, this means we have a vulnerability which precise blueprint to exploit is public. It's on a website, it's a bug bounty program, and they have published to YouTube or to other platforms exactly how you will exploit this vulnerability. Typically, these bug bounty programs, the vendor is given a chance to fix this before that happens, but often that isn't the case. Now, if something is public aware, it means that someone can follow this blueprint to exploit this vulnerability. But there is a phenomenon where not every public aware vulnerability becomes weaponized. That is the case because sometimes in order to exploit a vulnerability, a lot of very complex steps have to take place. I certainly wouldn't want to be an IT manager that took public aware and said, no, I don't think I'm going to remediate that vulnerability because it sounds too complex to exploit. The data is there so that you can choose the patches that are the most important, and the priorities, of course, are those that are being weaponized, could be weaponized, and are quite severe. Now, countermeasures offer a balance. So countermeasures allow us to deploy a workaround or a countermeasure instead of deploying the patch. If you can imagine, some of these patches are getting very large now, maybe 1.5 gigabytes. And in a highly distributed environment, maybe in retail, you're not able to deploy those patches very quickly. So countermeasures, if provided by the vendor, allow you to change something, install something in order to bypass the vulnerability. So we call these workarounds or mitigations. Workarounds, maybe you can change a registry key. In fact, we're going to talk about a registry key in just a few minutes. A registry key allows you to effectively bypass the vulnerability. Mitigations, maybe you have Microsoft Exchange installed and that's vulnerable, but it's a specific version with a specific condition that has to be enabled. Maybe you have a next generation antivirus and you don't need to apply the patch as quickly as if you didn't have that next generation antivirus. So countermeasures are there to help us choose the patches that we can bypass without patching if we need to deploy something very, very quickly. Now, finally, we need something to glue it all together. If we just take every severe vulnerability with 10 CVSS that is weaponized and is public aware and is not countermeasured, we have to take into account the exposure in your environment. So just how much of your environment is exposed will help us to determine the speed in which we will deploy our patches. And so if you have a higher percentage of exposure for vulnerabilities that maybe aren't as severe and are only weaponized but not public aware, but you have a lower exposure of a critical severity that is not weaponized but is public aware, it should in fact be lower priority than the first one. So it allows you to make an informed decision. What vulnerabilities am I deploying and how urgently am I deploying them based on exposure? So you put these together, we call it a SYX score. You put the SYX score together and you can make the best decision for deployment of patches in your environment. Now, if you're familiar with this format, we will jump now to the Syxsense website to take a look at the Patch Tuesday data. We do actually publish everything to the website the day of Patch Tuesday. So this would have been live last night, and we always hold the webinars the day after. So what we need to do is pop over to the website. Now on the website, we've got several links across the top here under the resources section. We've got fantastic resources covering really cool topics like zero trust, patch management strategies, and of course, why we're here, Patch Tuesday. We have lots of guides as well as best practices. If you haven't started a patching strategy or you would like to talk to us to see if maybe the strategy that you are using could be improved, use the chat or use the schedule a demo button in the corner there, and we can jump on a call with you. Now, as we mentioned, Patch Tuesday, we did have quite a lot of updates. Some of them are more serious, 75 in total, including 2 of these quite unique advanced notifications, which we'll talk about in a second. 6 are critical and 4 have a CVSS rated over 9. Now, we had fixes for pretty much all of the Microsoft operating systems, including Windows Components, Office Components, .NET Framework, Visual Studio, Azure, SQL Server, Exchange, SharePoint. We had a lot of Exchange updates, in fact, which was quite surprising, and Teams. They all had updates this month. Now, we have, as I mentioned, 4 of those which have a CVSS more than 9. But what is interesting is if I count all of the CVSS scores up, it actually is way less than last month. But that's because last month we had close to 100 fixes in Patch Tuesday. But in this month, the average CVSS score was 7.3, and that was higher than last month. So although last month we had more fixes, they were generally lower in CVSS score. And that's quite interesting. So although you have less vulnerabilities to deal with, you have more serious vulnerabilities to deal with. Now, I've made some recommendations. The first one is ADV 23003. This is the Microsoft Office Defense in-depth update. Now, this is following on from a CVE which was fixed several months ago, CVE 2023-36884. Microsoft is recommending that you install this update as well as upgrading to the latest version of Windows. As we mentioned, Windows 10 is coming end of life in 2025, and each feature update has its own end of life as well. Now, the defense in depth is not a vulnerability specifically, but installing the update stops the attack chain leading to Windows Search security feature bypass, which is that CVE I mentioned. Now, what is interesting is they're saying this is not a vulnerability, but it's weaponized, actually is actively being exploited. Now, we don't actually have a CVSS score for this one, but please be aware we will update the CVSS scores in the Syxsense console as soon as one is issued. The vendor severity is moderate, even though it's weaponized. That's rather strange. And it also is public aware with no countermeasure. So it's incredibly serious, and depending on whether you're using Microsoft Office in your environment, that one needs to be prioritized urgently. We actually had a couple of updates for Windows Message Queuing Remote Control Execution Vulnerability. That was CVE 2023-35385 and CVE 2023-36910. Now, to exploit this vulnerability, an attacker would need to send a specifically crafted malicious message queue packet to a message queue server, and this could result in remote code execution. Now, it is only vulnerable on a specific service that is running. So if you have Windows servers, but you don't have this installed, it will still be applicable, but it is not going to be vulnerable. So the message queuing service needs to be enabled for a system to be exploited by this vulnerability. So it can be installed, but if it's not turned on, okay, there you have your countermeasure. This feature can be added by the control panel, and you can check to see if there is a service running named message queuing and a TCP port 1801. Now, if successful exploitation of this vulnerability could allow an unauthenticated attacker to remotely execute code on the target. This patch does in fact require a reboot, so more serious if you don't have flexible reboot windows for your environment. This has a vendor severity of critical a CVSS of 9.8 is 2 below maximum. It's not weaponized at the moment and it's not public aware, but it can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction, and luckily it does not have a jump point. We did have quite a few of those updates that were being fixed this month. We also had a lot of exchange, and this is quite a trending thing. I'm finding that there's a lot of exchange fixes, and then maybe the next month there'll be some SharePoint, and then the next month there'll be some SQL Server. My third, I'm actually going to make a fourth recommendation based on new data that we've had. CVE 2023-21709. This is Microsoft Exchange elevation of privilege. So there's very little data actually about this vulnerability. It's very little. But what Microsoft have said is that in addition to installing the update, you need to run some scripts. So this is what we call a post-patch action. And in the past, many patches have been installed without reviewing the post-patch action that is necessary to fully close the loop to effectively resolve the vulnerability. Now, Microsoft is recommending two things: the Exchange Server 2016 or 2019 August SU update for later. After you've installed this update, you then need to run the script, which is actually named after the CVE, so CVE 2023-21709.ps1. That file can be found on the Microsoft site, so go ahead and download that and deploy that to your devices. If you have a couple of Exchange boxes, it may just be simpler to run the following command line in a PowerShell window. There is the path. Just basically pop that into a PowerShell on the server, and you can deploy that post-patch action. Syxsense customers will find these scripts available inside the vulnerabilities console under a family called post-patch. This one has a vendor severity of important and a CVSS score of 9.8. You see, there isn't always a correlation between what the vendor is saying and what this independent score. If you were just using severity on its own, this not being critical now, this being important, which is the next one down, potentially it may not have made it into a patching strategy if you're only using one element of data. So we use CVSS in this example to raise the priority. It isn't weaponized. It's not public aware at this point, which is great. However, it can be exploited over any network, including the internet. So any internet accessed Exchange boxes can be attacked with low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction. Luckily, this doesn't have a jump point. The last update I want to mention is another update, ADV 23004. This is a memory integrity system readiness scan tool, which is for the defense in depth, as we mentioned. It has a moderate severity. It's not yet allocated a CVSS score, but I want to highlight this because it is, in fact, being weaponized. Now, this particular update can detect compatibility issues with memory integrity, also known as hypervisor protected code integrity, HVCI. The memory integrity scan tool is available to download for Windows 10, 11, and the server OS. Now, for the remaining updates, as we've got listed in this page here, we've taken all the elements of those 6 factors. Of course, we can't put your exposure into here, but we're assuming that these are highly detected, and these particular vulnerabilities will, in order, if you put the CVE into your console, whether you're using Syxsense, whether you're using WSUS, put those into the console, and if you have a high detection rate, please go ahead and deploy them. Excuse me. So that's it for this week. Just want to thank everybody for joining me today. If you are at Black Hat, please pop by and say hello to us. If you would like to speak to us about starting a trial or see maybe how Syxsense can help you with your patching strategy, please do so. And until next time, I wish you happy patching.